Alright, so a beautiful day here at Pescadero State Beach. Thinking of making something of the scene behind me. I'm mostly attracted to the shadow cast on the sand. I will be moving the rocks around a bit. I think this rock right here, I might move that out a bit. But I'm going to use this scene for inspiration. I'm painting on a 16 by 20 inch gessoed panel, and I've got my usual limited palette of colors here. I've got some cadmium yellow lemon, cadmium yellow medium, titanium white, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue. There's some dioxazine purple and some permanent red medium. I started my sketch using burnt sienna, just trying to establish the big shapes. I was going to do a distance scene, but I like the idea of doing a close-up of these rocks or this cliff here because the shapes are simpler and a little bit more interesting. So I've got a nice shadow cast onto this cliff, and then there is the cast shadow on the sand down below. I've just been playing around with some rocks here, just trying to decide if I do want to include some of these rocks that are in the foreground. I may eliminate those just to simplify. There's a rock over here that's in full sunlight, not a lot of shadow on this particular rock, but I think I will include it. It'll be a nice bit of orange to you know, play off the blues and the greens. I'm going to need to have an interesting whitewater pattern out in the distance in order to draw the eye out, hopefully towards the horizon. And I've put a bit of land up here. It's further over to the right, but I've decided to move it into the picture for compositional purposes. So that is the basic idea. The waves in the distance are sort of horizontal, but they do start curving in as they get closer to the shore. That'll be nice because it'll get some diagonals into the painting. For my darkest dark, I've got a mixture here of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and a bit of alizarin crimson. The mix is fairly thin at this point. I do want to keep some transparency in these darks. I don't want them to feel too heavy. I do want to try to work quickly with this painting. I may need to lighten the value of these rocks in the distance just to push them back, but for now, I just want to establish the shapes and just see if I like the pattern. I'm going to add a few shadows at the base of this rock, maybe another one on the edge like that. We'll see. Those might disappear. There's kind of a shadow up here too. The water out in the distance closest to the horizon has sort of an ultramarine tint to it, so I did mix up a blue-green color, but then I added some titanium white and a bit of ultramarine just to push it more towards blue. As we get closer to shore here, there's more yellow in the water, so it turns more green. But I'm just approximating colors and values at this point, and mostly just focusing on shapes. I'm using this scene as inspiration, but I have moved around the rocks, and I've sort of moved all of the elements around to hopefully make for a good composition. Okay, blocking in the sand here. And I want to make sure that the value of the sand is dark enough that the whitewater stands out against the sand. Often when staring at something bright like the sand or a street, you'll have a tendency to make the mix too light. So I'm erring on the side of too dark at this point. I do feel like I'm going to have to lighten this up a bit, but I'd rather start off dark and then lighten it up a bit. All right, for the light portion on the rocks, I'm really pushing the yellow here. I'll definitely be adding some variation to these colors, but I want to establish a feeling of light in the painting as soon as possible. So I am going to push the warmth. And then this cliff has some light along the top. And then there's light coming down this way. This is kind of confusing because now my lights, like here and here, are darker than my shadow shapes. I'm gonna lighten them up just a little bit here. But my shadow shapes are still intact. All right, I've mixed some dioxazine purple into my light mix here. I'm using this mix for my shadows. And I do want to keep these shadows somewhat transparent as well. I'm using a number 8 natural bristle flat. This brush holds a lot of paint. It's not very accurate. Kind of a big mop in a way. All right, I added some more ultramarine to the mix for the shadow cast on the sand here. And I will be further defining these shapes. I just want to get the colors and shapes blocked in, and then I can decide what the painting needs. It's another reason I'm keeping the paint thin at this point. It's a lot easier to go over thin paint than it is going over thick paint. If you put the paint on too thick early on, you can scrape it down. But sometimes when you scrape down the paint, it is hard to get back the transparent strokes, kind of like that. All right, so there's some ice plant here in the foreground, and I'm just blocking this in using medium tone green. And I think I'll need to lighten this up a bit, but I don't want it to be too bright because I don't want it to detract from this bit of land right here. I want the eye to kind of pass over this foreground to this. So I'm sure I'll be playing around with the colors and values in this area. I'm sure I will, as I will with the other areas as well. I'm feeling like I want an additional bit of white water, maybe to come through this shadow here, maybe wrap around like this. It's always nice to have things like white water coming into the shadow. When you have something that's half in the shadow and half out, or half in the shadow and half out of the shadow, it does help to create a convincing feeling of light. And now I've got some titanium white and ultramarine blue, maybe to add a little bit of variety within the shadow. All right, for the distant mountains, I've got a mixture of titanium white, ultramarine blue, and a touch of alizarin crimson. I want to make sure that this mix is light enough in value that these mountains sit off in the distance. There's also a bit of mist over the water, especially at the base of the mountain. So the base of the mountain is lighter in value, but I'll be adding that later. All right, for the sky, I've got a mixture of titanium white and a touch of phthalo blue. The sky is another thing that you can mix too light in value. So I'm comparing the sky to the whitewater. The whitewater is the lightest value in the painting, or the lightest value in the scene. So I want to make sure that this whitewater stands out in comparison to the sky. When I first started painting, I remember reading somewhere that the sky is always the lightest object in the painting, and that caused me a lot of trouble, actually, because often it is not. So sometimes these little rules that you hear are not true, and it's best just to rely on your own observation. All right, I'm liking the shapes in here, but I feel like I want to bring down the whitewater a bit, like this, maybe. All right, I think this shadow shape here needs to be a little bit darker. So I've added some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple to my shadow mix. All right, I've mixed up a saturated orange to get some reflected light into these rocks. There's a surprising amount of warmth in these shadows here, and I want to make sure I capture that. As the shadows get closer to the top of the cliff here, they get cooler in temperature, so I'm exaggerating the blues and purples. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of variety into this rock in the foreground here. Going with some rust colors. And I've switched over to a number 6 natural bristle flat. And there is some red in the base of these rocks here. I will probably have to come back and define the water line just a little bit. All right, I'm adding a bit of variety to the ice plant in the foreground, and I want to make sure that I get some red into the greens here, so it's not just a pure green. All right, so here's what I finished up with. This painting took about 2 hours to complete. It was finished on site. I'm considering making some changes. I'm not crazy about the shape of this cliff here in the foreground. I might remove this corner here, and then I might also have the cliff cut back a little bit underneath here, which is something it did in real life, but I think I might just exaggerate that. Some things I like about the painting: I feel like there's a convincing feeling of light, and I also like the color. It's a nice saturation. It's more just compositional things that bother me about it. For example, I think there could be a more unified whitewater pattern. I do like the shadow, and if there's any takeaway from this painting, I think it's the idea, you know, of having something that's outside the shadow then go into the shadow. That makes the shadows look less pasted on and more convincing. That's something that took me a while to incorporate into my paintings, but I think it makes a big difference in having convincing shadows. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you'd like to see some extra videos and help support the channel, there's a Patreon link down below. It's a Patreon support that helps keep me making these videos, and it's much appreciated, so check it out. Other than that, stay creative. I'll see you guys in the next video.